This is episode 2, Descriptivism versus Prescriptivism. When I was growing up, I was lucky enough to have educated parents who took care of me in my education. However, they were very strict on the manner in which I spoke. And here are some snippets of my own parental grammar education. Me, that's me. Dad picked me and Lucy up from the shops. Dad picked me and Lucy up from the shops. And my mum would say, Anna, it's Lucy and I. I'd just like to point out here that it is actually Lucy and me, or me and Lucy, because it's the object of the sentence, and we'll talk about that later down the track. Or I would say, who are you going to dinner with, Mum? And Mum would say, it's with whom are you going to dinner? But of course I wasn't going to dinner at all. Another example, I said, and I can lift my feet up to really make it go fast. And my mother would say, it's to make it go really fast. And finally, I might say, I'm doing this wrong, aren't I? And she would respond, it's, I'm doing this wrong, am I not? To which I probably should have responded, no, you're doing it just fine. But of course I didn't. Well, you get the gist. The point is not to have a gripe at my mother, but rather to show how people like me have been raised with a very prescriptivist ideology. But what is a prescriptivist ideology? A prescriptivist grammar is one that gives hard and fast rules about what is right and what is wrong, often with advice about what not to say, but with little explanation. And that's from the Advanced English Grammar, A Linguistic Approach from 2012. In fact, if I had asked my mother why these utterances I was saying were wrong, she would respond, well, it's just not proper English. So the concept of correct and incorrect grammar became popular in the 1700s and was first inspired by the Right Reverend Robert Louth, that's him, in his book, A Short Introduction to the English Grammar with Critical Notes. And this was written in 1762. Louth actually intended this book for his son as a foundation in Latin. He thought that if he described some of the rules in English, it would help with his son's Latin, but it was marketed and sold as an English grammar book, causing it to become very popular and then copied, pirated and plagiarised by other writers. There were several important reasons that contributed to the trend of prescriptivist grammar kicked off by this book during the mid-18th century. At that time, there was an urgency to create a standard English that everyone should speak. And at that time also, Latin was seen to be the most pure and admirable language of all, and so it seemed acceptable that many of the rules found in Latin could be imposed onto English. Furthermore, people were climbing the socio-economic ladder during the Industrial Revolution of the time, and therefore put great value on speaking correctly to distinguish them from people of the lower class. David Crystal, a renowned linguist, describes this movement in the following way. Prescriptivist grammarians went out of their way to invent as many rules as possible which might distinguish polite from impolite speech. He goes on, and these rules were propounded with maximum authority and severity, and as a result, generations of school children would be taught them and confused by them. And that's from David Crystal's book, The Fight for English, written in 2006. And here's a snippet from Louth's book himself. Remember him? So you can get an insight and understand the rules that were imposed by prescriptivist grammarians aiming to standardise to correct English. Adjectives are sometimes employed as adverbs, improperly and not agreeably to the genius of the English language. That's directly from his book. Now, whether or not you understand the rule itself is inconsequential. What is important here is that these rules are accommodated with a personal appraisal of whether the language is good or bad. So, for example, he says here, improperly and not agreeably to the genius of the English language. So that's clearly his own perception of the language imposed in that book. Prescriptivist grammarians have actually had a huge impact on how we speak today. One example of this is the word ain't. So I'm going to write ain't up here. So we consider the following contractions. Are not becomes aren't. Was not becomes wasn't. Were not becomes weren't. Is not becomes isn't. But what of am not? What becomes of that? Well, historically, am not became, you guessed it, ain't. And saying I ain't was actually considered perfectly fine until English speakers started saying you ain't, she ain't, we ain't, they ain't, it ain't. So we put them all onto ain't because, you know, that's what English speakers did. And the grammarians, the prescriptivist grammarians went, no, we can't use ain't like that, it's no good. It's incorrect. And they made the word ain't so unacceptable that it was no longer considered appropriate to use ain't, even in its original context, I ain't. Gone. So now what? Now can we use for a contraction, what can we use for a contraction of am not? Well, sometimes we use aren't. For example, I'm going shopping today, aren't I? But actually, the only reason why we're using aren't is because it's the closest that we have to ain't. Really, grammatically, it's not correct either. So what have we got left? Well, I'll tell you what we've got. We've got am I not? No correction at all. No, so no contraction at all. So my mother was correct after all. And that's the kind of impact that prescriptivist grammarians have had on our language. But there is another way to approach grammar, and that's with what we call the descriptivist approach. Now, the descriptivist approach is a scientific approach to the study of language. It describes and observes linguistic behaviour without making value judgments. So that's what we're going to do. We're not going to make any judgments about what's right and wrong. Instead, we're going to observe and comment on it from a scientific perspective. And we're going to do this by, at first, breaking English down into its subsystems. So, until then, thanks for watching The Language Code.